There is a thought that lives in the back of the mind of every inquisitor who has ever seriously studied the Tyranids. Not the scholars who process the sanitized reports from behind a desk, not the strategists who convert horror into arrows on a star chart, but the ones who have actually been to the places where a hive fleet has been. The ones who have stood on worlds that used to have billions of living things on them and now have nothing. Not ruins, not bones, not even ash, just rock. Just the silent, sterile surface of a planet that once breathed and no longer does, because breathing requires life, and life requires biology, and biology has been consumed down to the very last molecule and pulled back up into the retreating fleet above. Those inquisitors come back changed. Most of them file their reports using the precise clinical language that the Ordos prefer. They write about biomass consumption rates and synapse network disruption patterns and optimal defensive configurations for contested world engagements. They write in the language of problems that have solutions, because that is the only way to keep functioning. And then, late at night, in private, in notes sealed under encryption codes that will not be broken until they are long dead, they write the other thing. The thing that does not fit in any Ordos report. The question that is not a tactical consideration or a strategic concern, but something older and stranger and harder to set down without feeling ridiculous, and then feeling afraid when you realize you don't feel ridiculous at all. If the Tyranids are the greatest predators the galaxy has ever produced, and if they came from somewhere else, from beyond the rim of the galaxy itself, from the cold absolute emptiness of the intergalactic void, where nothing lives and nothing grows, and the light of the nearest stars is so faint it barely registers even to instruments, then something about that journey needs explaining. They did not stumble here by accident. The distances involved are too immense for accident to mean anything. They made that crossing deliberately, on a heading that brought them here, conserving their biological reserves across unimaginable spans of time and space. They left wherever they came from. They crossed something vast and empty to get here. And the question that keeps surfacing in those sealed private files is this: why did they leave? Because the Tyranids do not leave worlds early. That is not something they are capable of choosing. Every cell of biological matter on a targeted planet is consumed. Every ecosystem, however small, however deep in the rock, or compressed into the sediment of a deep ocean trench, is stripped. The process is total. The hive fleet does not depart until its target is completely and permanently emptied of everything the word life could apply to. This is not efficiency for efficiency's sake. This is biological imperative at the level of instinct, at a level so deep that describing it as a choice misunderstands what the hive mind is. The hive mind needs that biomass. It needs the raw material to produce new organisms, grow new bioforms, replenish what was spent in the fighting, and build reserves for the transit to the next feeding ground. Leaving food on the plate is not something the hive mind can decide to do. The category of decision doesn't apply. And yet here they are, having crossed the void from somewhere else, having spent unimaginable time in transit through space that offers nothing nutritionally useful, having arrived at the Milky Way in a state that, if a human parallel helps you understand it, resembles someone who has crossed a desert on almost no water and arrives at the oasis, attacking it with everything they have. The urgency of the Tyranid invasion, the relentlessness of it, the way every hive fleet has driven harder and consumed faster and adapted more aggressively than any previous threat the Imperium has faced, all of that makes more sense when you consider that the fleet may have been without food for longer than human history has existed. They came from somewhere. They left that somewhere. They crossed the cold between to get here. And the question of what they left behind and why is one that the setting has never answered with finality. The official lore of Warhammer 40K presents two broad answers, both of which are frightening in very different registers. The first is hunger. Simple, absolute, bottomless hunger. The idea that the Tyranids have been doing this across uncountable galaxies for so long that they simply consumed everything available in their last location, and the Milky Way is the next meal. Nothing drove them out. Nothing is behind them. They left because there was nothing left to stay for, the way a fire moves to new fuel when the old fuel is ash. The last world was stripped. The last microorganism was pulled up into the digestion pools. The biological heritage of an entire galaxy Billions of years of evolution and speciation and the rise and fall of civilizations had been absorbed and processed and turned into more Tyranids, and then those Tyranids consumed the next thing, until there was no next thing left. And then the fleet went dormant and drifted into the void, following whatever faint gravitational gradient or biological instinct carried it toward the next potential source of food, and eventually the Milky Way lit up on their sensors, and they turned. The second answer is worse. The possibility that something drove them from wherever they were. That the Tyranids, vast and terrible as they are, encountered something in their previous galaxy that their adaptations could not overcome, that their numbers could not outlast, that the intelligence of the hive mind could not outwit or outlast. That, faced with that something, the only viable option was to abandon the territory and run, cross the void, find somewhere new, hope that whatever was behind them could not follow, or would not, or was not interested enough in a depleted galaxy to bother. The idea of something that makes the great devourer flee is one of the most quietly devastating concepts in all of Warhammer 40K. The setting is not lacking for horror. It contains chaos, the literal corruption of reality itself. It contains the Necrons with their 60 million years of dormancy, and the indestructible bodies, and the world-ending weapons they built when the galaxy was young, and the setting's other major factions were not yet born. It contains the fury and scale of the Orks, the tragic arc of the Eldar. But, for the specific flavor of cosmic dread, for the sensation of genuine insignificance in the face of something the universe contains that doesn't care what you think about it, nothing in the setting quite matches the thought of something that makes the Great Devourer afraid. We are going to work through all of it in this video. The history of how the Tyranids found the Milky Way, the nature of what they are, and what makes them unlike any other faction, the evidence from the lore about where they have been before arriving here, the canonical sources that bear on the central question, the theories that have grown around those sources, and at the end, what the answer to this question, in any of its possible forms, means for everyone and everything living inside this galaxy. Before all of that, though, a foundation is needed. Because the Tyranids are most commonly encountered as a tabletop faction, as a force to paint and field and play against, and that context necessarily compresses and abstracts what they actually are within the fiction. The game mechanics describe bioforms and synapse units and hive fleet traits. The lore describes something that barely fits inside the word faction, something operating at a register so different from every other threat in the setting that understanding it properly changes how everything else looks. So we start from the beginning, we build the picture slowly, and then we ask the question. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing where these things end up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment, because there is a great deal more of this kind of deep lore to come, and it all goes this far down. One more thing worth establishing before we move forward, and it has to do with why the question of the Tyranids' motivation matters in a way that goes beyond simple narrative curiosity. Every other major threat in the Warhammer 40K setting has a relationship with its own motivation that the defenders can, in principle, exploit. Chaos wants souls, it wants corruption. It wants to pull things into ruin through the specific weaknesses of the things it corrupts. That means it has preferences, and preferences can be predicted, and things that can be predicted can sometimes be prepared for. The Chaos Gods compete with each other, and their competition creates fractures that a clever enough opponent can occasionally use. The Necrons want to reclaim the galaxy, to reverse biotransference, to restore what was lost when the Satan made them what they are. That motivation produces patterns of behavior, alliances, and non-attacks, and calculated restraint that defenders who understand it can sometimes anticipate. The Orks want war. They want the biggest, most glorious battle they can find. That desire is simple and consistent enough that it creates certain tactical and strategic patterns that experienced opponents have learned to read. The Tyranids want to eat. That is it. That is the full extent of the relationship between their motivation and anything that might be exploited by a defender. There are no secondary goals. There are no competing factions within the hive mind that could be played against each other, because the hive mind is not divided. There are no resources the hive mind is conserving for some future purpose that would constrain its current behavior, because the hive mind's purpose is fully expressed in the current behavior. Every adaptation it makes is in service of feeding more efficiently. Every tactical evolution is toward the goal of consuming more biomass, more quickly, with fewer losses. There is nothing in the hive mind that wants something other than what it is doing. This is why the question of whether they are running from something is so significant, because if they are, then somewhere in that motivation there is a variable we did not know existed. If the hive mind carries within it the memory of a conflict it lost, or a threat it could not overcome, then the behavior of the hive fleets in the Milky Way is shaped not just by hunger, but by something that could, in principle, be understood and used. Not exploited in the simple sense of creating an opening in a battle line, but understood in the way that understanding an enemy's deepest fear can change the strategic picture entirely. And if they are not running from anything, then the behavior of the hive fleets is exactly what it appears to be at the surface: pure predatory drive applied at galactic scale, with no other dimension to account for. And that means the only variables available to the defenders are efficiency of killing and speed of adaptation, and the hive mind is better at both of those things than anything the galaxy has produced. Neither answer is comfortable, but one of them contains a door, even if it is very small and very difficult to find. The other contains only walls. That distinction is why Inquisitors write their private notes, not because they expect to solve the mystery, but because sitting with the question keeps them looking for the door. Part 2. What the Tyranids actually are. To genuinely understand what makes the Tyranids different from every other faction in the setting, you have to start not with the creatures themselves, but with the consciousness that directs them. Every other faction in Warhammer 40K, from the Emperor on his golden throne to the Chaos Gods burning in the Imperium, from the ancient Necron dynasties to the youngest freshly founded Space Marine chapter, can be understood at some level through the lens of intent. They want things. They have goals. Those goals are often terrible and alien, but they are still recognizable as desires. There is something there that wants something. That is enough of a foundation to work with. The hive mind does not have desires in that sense. It has a drive, a single, ancient, all-consuming biological imperative that underlies every decision and every action and every adaptation. The drive is to feed. Not to conquer territory, not to spread an ideology, not to survive in any way that involves coexisting with other living things alongside it, just to feed, to consume, to take all available biological material into itself, strip it down to its component genetic sequences, absorb what is useful, discard what is redundant, and use the energy and raw material gained to produce more Tyranids, which will then go out and consume more things, which will fuel the production of more Tyranids still. The cycle is simple. It is total. It is perfect in the particular horrible way that things with no moving parts are perfect. The hive mind is a gestalt consciousness. That word gestalt matters and is worth sitting with for a moment. It means the intelligence does not exist in any individual place or individual creature. It cannot be pointed to. It is not located in any given hive ship or any given hive tyrant or in any physical location you could target and destroy. It is the emergent property of all the creatures together, the collective psychic resonance of trillions of organisms simultaneously networked to one another across the fabric of space, feeding information upward and receiving directives downward in a process that has no off switch and no central node whose removal would collapse the whole. When a Hormigaunt dies on the surface of a contested world, that death registers in the hive mind as information. The circumstances of the death, what caused it, what weapon configuration defeated it, what tactical situation led to the creature being in a position where it could be killed, all of that data flows upward and is processed. When a Carnifex tears through a fortress wall and meets resistance it has not encountered before, the nature of that resistance is filed. When a hive tyrant loses an engagement because the defenders used a particular flanking maneuver, the maneuver is recorded and countermeasures are developed. Every single engagement, every failure and success, every tactical interaction across every world the Tyranids have ever touched, it all flows into this one vast mind and is learned from. This is why you cannot truly defeat the Tyranids. You can win a battle, you can break a splinter fleet, you can hold a world, but the hive mind learns from every defeat, and every subsequent wave incorporates everything the previous one learned. The Ultramarines shattered hive fleet behemoth at the Battle of Macragge, by concentrating their forces, exploiting the geography of the polar fortresses, and using the Imperial Navy to destroy the fleet from orbit in a killing ground the Tyranids could not effectively avoid. That tactic worked once. It would not work in the same way again, because the hive mind absorbed what happened at Macragge, and the next fleet, Kraken, came with a completely different structural approach. Behemoth had been a fist. Kraken came as fingers, too many of them, too spread out to counter in the same concentrated way. The individual creatures are not personally intelligent in any meaningful sense. A hormigaunt, when cut off from the synapse network that carries the hive mind's will, degenerates almost immediately into a feral animal. It does not make tactical decisions. It does not experience fear as a strategic consideration. Without the synapse signal, it simply follows the deepest biological instinct it has, which is to attack anything in reach, and that instinct without direction is far less dangerous than the same creature under coordinated psychic control. This is the fundamental weakness that Imperial defenders have learned over the course of 3 tyrannic wars to exploit. Kill the synapse creatures, the larger and more intelligent organisms that act as relay nodes for the hive mind's direction, and the smaller ones lose coherence. They scatter, they follow prey instinct rather than strategy. Undirected prey instinct is still dangerous, because a hormigaunt with no strategic purpose is still a hormigaunt, but it is manageable in a way that coordinated swarms are not. The synapse creatures themselves are something else. The hive tyrant is a being of genuine tactical intelligence, processing battlefield information in real time, adapting its forces mid-engagement, communicating the hive mind's intent to everything within its psychic range. The Swarm Lord, the rarest and most powerful of the hive mind's direct instruments, is something stranger still. It is unique, not a type of creature, but a specific creation, the hive mind's finest single expression of tactical will. When a Swarm Lord is destroyed in battle, which is not easy, the knowledge of how it was destroyed is absorbed through the synapse network back into the hive mind, and the next Swarm Lord, spawned, carries that knowledge as memory. Every death the Swarm Lord has experienced becomes information the next version was born with. You cannot defeat a Swarm Lord the same way twice, because the second time, it already knows how the first time ended. The biology of individual organisms is worth spending a moment on because it illustrates something important about what the Tyranids are at a fundamental level. Every weapon a Tyranid carries is a living thing. The Devourer, a common ranged weapon, is a symbiotic organism grafted to its host that launches other small organisms as projectiles, creatures that burrow into flesh and dissolve it from the inside using biological acids. The Lash Whip is a long tendril of specialized nerve and muscle, capable of reacting faster than any mechanical system. The scything talons that warrior-class organisms carry are not manufactured blades, but evolved structures of biological chitin, grown to precise specifications for the types of armor they are expected to encounter. Everything the Tyranids bring to battle is alive. Everything can adapt and mutate in response to what it encounters, and everything that fails gets the failure noted, and the next version is built better. The hive ships themselves are the most remarkable expression of this biological engineering philosophy. They are not vessels that contain and transport Tyranids. They are Tyranids, living creatures of such immense scale that smaller ships can dock with them the way pilotfish accompany sharks, finding shelter and purpose in the vast creature's presence. The interior of a hive ship is warm and wet and biological. The passages between chambers flex like blood vessels. The walls contract and expand. The whole structure breathes in some functional analog to the word. It is connected to the hive mind and aware, in the diffuse, distributed sense that a body is aware of its own cells, of everything happening within and around it. When it takes damage in battle, it grows new tissue to replace the lost sections. When it needs to reconfigure for a different operational phase, it reshapes internally. Nothing on or in a hive ship is inert. Everything is alive and serves a purpose. These ships do not use the warp to travel between stars. This is a critical detail, one that sets the Tyranids apart from essentially every other spacefaring species in the setting, and one that becomes significant when we start examining theories about what might be behind them. The Tyranids are cut off from the warp, not because they lack the ability to access it in some technical sense, but because the massive collective psychic presence of the hive mind suppresses it. The hive mind is so vast and so alien that it crowds the Imperium out, projects into it not as a navigating entity, but as an interference field, the phenomenon the Imperium calls the shadow in the warp. The shadow in the warp is not a side effect or a byproduct. It is one of the Tyranids' most powerful tools. It extends dozens of light years in every direction from the fleet, a smothering psychic blanket that severs the connection between the warp and the material universe within its radius. Astropathic communication, the psychic messaging system the Imperium uses to coordinate across interstellar distances, becomes impossible or severely degraded inside the shadow. Navigators trying to find their way through the warp using the Astronomicon as a reference point find that beacon dimmed and distorted inside the shadow, making safe warp transit extremely dangerous. Psychers of all kinds suffer acutely inside the shadow, their connection to the Imperium overwhelmed by the alien static of the hive mind pressing in on every level of perception. For a world in the path of an approaching hive fleet, the shadow arrives before the first ship is even visible. It descends like a psychic fog. Suddenly, the astropaths can no longer reach the broader network. Ships cannot safely jump to get help or to evacuate. The world's psychers begin to suffer, distracted and destabilized by sensations they have no frame of reference for. The world is already alone before anyone knows the fleet is coming. The invasion begins, in the most important strategic sense, the moment the shadow falls. Everything that follows, the spore pods and the drop organisms, and the wave after wave of bioforms descending from the sky, is the closing of a trap that was already shut. In place of warp travel, the Tyranids move through the material universe using gravity manipulation. Specialized hive ships generate focused gravity fields that interact with the fabric of space itself, allowing the fleet to achieve faster-than-light velocity without touching the Imperium. This capability, evolved or engineered, tells us something about the environment in which the Tyranids became what they are. Whatever galaxy they originated from, whatever conditions shaped their development over billions of years, those conditions produced an organism that found a way to move between stars without relying on a psychic dimension that it suppresses by its own existence. The Tyranids and the warp are incompatible at a fundamental level. They may have been that way from the beginning. The Norn Queens are the biological center of the production system. These creatures, among the rarest and most heavily protected organisms in any hive fleet, are responsible for creating every other organism in the swarm. They take in raw biomass, the digested and processed remains of everything the fleet has consumed, and they grow new creatures from it using a genetic library of extraordinary depth and range. Every species the hive mind has ever consumed has contributed to that library. When a Norn queen produces a new organism, it is not random variation, but directed specification, grown to a defined purpose by a mind that has been accumulating biological options for longer than the Milky Way has had complex, multicellular life on most of its worlds. When an improved design is developed anywhere in the fleet, the genetic specification propagates through the synapse network to every Norn queen in every hive fleet simultaneously, not gradually, not through physical communication. The update travels at the speed of the psychic link, and within what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink, every Norn queen everywhere in the Tyranid presence is producing the improved version. This is what adaptation means when the Tyranids do it. Not slow generational drift. Directed engineering, drawing on the deepest possible accumulated genetic heritage, executed in real time across an entire species, scattered across multiple fleets in a galaxy they are actively consuming. The genetic library this gives the hive mind access to is staggering in its depth. Every species the Tyranids have ever consumed contributed to it. Every defensive adaptation that any organism anywhere in any galaxy they have visited has ever evolved is cataloged. Every offensive capability, every novel biological solution to a survival challenge, everything that worked well enough in any environment anywhere is filed away. When the hive mind encounters something new, it searches that library and finds the closest applicable precedent, modifies it as needed, and deploys the solution. This is why each successive hive fleet is harder to stop than the last. They are not just adapting to what they have encountered in the Milky Way. They are drawing on a heritage that stretches across galaxies and billions of years. The Tyranids we are fighting in the Milky Way's wars carry in their biology the accumulated genetic heritage of civilizations we will never know the names of. The organisms that descended on Tyran in 745, M41, had already incorporated the evolutionary achievements of whatever species lived in the galaxies consumed before this one. The ones fighting in the Fourth Tyrannic War today are built from the combined biological legacy of a history that reaches further back than anything in this galaxy's recorded past. They have seen more species, consumed more worlds, encountered more novel biological challenges, and solved more of them than any force in the Milky Way can fully comprehend. This is what we are dealing with. Not an alien empire with ambitions and political structures. Not a faction with a command structure that can be decapitated. A living weapon of unfathomable scale, built from billions of years of accumulated evolutionary experience, directed by an intelligence that exists simultaneously across trillions of organisms, and that experiences every engagement in the galaxy as information and every living thing as potential raw material. The Tyranids are not fighting for something. They are not building toward a goal. They are simply eating, and they have been eating for longer than most of the setting's oldest civilizations can remember, and they will continue to eat until something stops them. Now we can ask why they are here. But before we do, there is one more dimension of what the Tyranids are that is worth sitting with, because it has direct bearing on the question that drives this entire video. The hive mind does not experience time the way that mortal or even long-lived organic creatures do. It is distributed across space. It operates continuously, without sleep, without rest, without the biological need to periodically suspend consciousness. Its component organisms cycle through their lifespans, are born and consumed and replaced, but the mind itself continues unbroken. It has been running, without interruption, for as long as it has existed. And how long that is, the lore does not specify precisely, but the evidence available suggests it is an extraordinarily long time. The Swarm Lord, the hive mind's most potent direct instrument, can be destroyed and reborn with the full memory of every previous engagement it has ever fought. That memory goes back to the beginning of the Swarm Lord's existence as a recurring creation of the hive mind, and through the Swarm Lord's memory, the hive mind itself possesses a direct experiential record of every battle it has ever directed the Swarm Lord to fight. That record includes battles fought in the Milky Way before the Tyrannic Wars, because gene stealers and other vanguard organisms have been operating in this galaxy for longer than the official Tyrannic Wars timeline accounts for. The Ordo Xenos found evidence of possible Tyranid presences as far back as the 35th millennium. Some researchers believe the earliest genestealer infiltrations began even before that. The hive mind has been watching this galaxy for thousands of years before it formally invaded, gathering data, testing responses, mapping defenses through its vanguard organisms, and through the psychic network that connects all Tyranid bioforms to the collective intelligence. When Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived in 745, M41, the Imperium was encountering the Tyranids for what it understood as the first time. The hive mind had been studying the Imperium for a significant portion of the Imperium's history. The implications of that observational period, for everything from the genestealer cults buried inside Imperial worlds to the specific tactical approaches of the named hive fleets, are enormous and would justify an entire separate video. But for our current purposes, the point is this. Whatever the hive mind knows about why it is here, about where it came from, about what, if anything, drove it into the void, it carries that knowledge without any of the cognitive distortions that time inflicts on organic memory. It does not forget. It does not misremember. It does not mythologize. If there is something behind the Tyranids, the hive mind knows about it with perfect clarity and has been carrying that knowledge continuously since whenever the relevant events occurred. That perfect memory, locked inside an entity that does not communicate with anything outside itself in ways that would make the information accessible, is one of the deepest structural ironies of the mystery. The answer exists. It is recorded somewhere inside the most alien and least accessible mind in the setting. And every tool available to the setting's characters for extracting information from unwilling subjects, from inquisitorial psychic interrogation to Eldar seer vision to Necron analytical technology, either does not work on the hive mind or has never been successfully applied to it in a way that produced the kind of testimony this question would require. The answer is there. the setting has just placed it somewhere that no one in the setting can reach. Part 3. The Pharos and the Awakening. The story of how the Tyranids found the Milky Way begins not with the Tyranids, but with a war, and with a decision made during that war, under desperate circumstances, by people who had no way of knowing what the consequences would be for everyone who came after them. The war was the Horus Heresy, the greatest catastrophe in the history of the Imperium of man, the moment when the Emperor's vision for humanity came the closest it has ever come to complete and permanent destruction. The Horus Heresy split the Space Marine legions in half. Brother fought brother across hundreds of worlds. The warp screamed with the psychic fallout of millions of deaths, and the active involvement of the Chaos Gods, who had invested enormously in the rebellion and were present in its violence in ways that corrupted the Imperium across entire sectors. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon, projected from Terra by the Emperor himself that guides ships safely through the warp, was weakened and intermittent. Safe navigation across interstellar distances became genuinely difficult in a way it had not been since before the Emperor's Great Crusade. In the eastern reaches of what would eventually become known as the Ultima Segmentum, on a world called Sotha, there was a device that had become critically important to the Loyalist war effort. It was called the Pharos. The Pharos was ancient technology. It predated the Imperium by an enormous margin, and it was not human in origin. It was Necron construction, built by the skeletal machine race before their 60 million year sleep, using principles of psychic engineering and gravitational manipulation that the Imperium of the 41st millennium cannot fully replicate. The Necrons, at the height of their civilization, built things that were not merely advanced, but were operating on conceptual levels that later species struggled to even frame correctly. The Pharos functioned as a beacon, a navigational lighthouse of extraordinary power and range. During the heresy, with the Astronomicon weakened, ships crossing the eastern reaches of the galaxy were navigating in extremely dangerous conditions, their navigators struggling to maintain a reliable psychic fix. The Pharos provided an alternative reference point, projecting a signal powerful enough to guide ships through the chaos when the Emperor's own beacon was insufficient. For Loyalist forces operating in the eastern theater of the war, it was a strategic asset of the First Order. The Night Lord's Legion, one of the Chaos Space Marine forces, understood what the facility represented. They came to take it or destroy it. The battle that followed, detailed in Guy Haley's novel Pharos, was a grinding, brutal defensive action that cost the Loyalist forces heavily. Ultramarines and Imperial Fist elements held the facility against a legion that had turned cruelty into an art form and tactical excellence into something close to science. They held it, but the situation deteriorated. The Night Lord's fleet had the upper hand. The ground was being lost. In the final critical moment, with the Night Lord's fleet closing and the ground forces being overwhelmed, the Loyalist commanders made a decision. They overloaded the Pharos. They pushed power through the device far beyond anything the Necrons who built it had intended, channeling energy into it until the lighthouse became something like a weapon, a pulse of psychic force so powerful that it scattered the Night Lord's fleet into emergency warp translation and bought the defenders the window they needed. It worked. The Night Lords were driven off. The facility survived the immediate threat. By any measure of the immediate situation, it was the right call, made by people doing what was necessary to survive a battle they were losing. But the pulse did not stop at the edge of the system. It did not stop at the edge of the Ultima Segmentum. It propagated outward at light speed and beyond, through both the material universe and the warp simultaneously, resonating and amplifying in ways that normal signals do not. It reached further than any signal of its type had a right to reach. Past the eastern fringe of the galaxy, past the last stars, past the boundary where the galaxy ends and the absolute void between galaxies begins. Out into the dark between the stars of the local group, where the distances between galaxies are measured in millions of light years, and the temperature of space is so close to absolute zero that nothing should have been listening. Something was listening, something vast and cold and dormant and very, very hungry. The sensor organisms of Tyranid hive ships registered the pulse. These are specialized bioforms whose entire existence is devoted to detecting potential food sources. Creatures evolved specifically to recognize the psychic signature of rich biological environments from extraordinary distances, and to wake the fleet when they find one. They could not have understood the Pharaoh's signal in any sophisticated way. They did not need to. The signal indicated the presence of something biologically significant, something worth waking up for. And so they fired their signals inward, through the biological architecture of the ships they were part of, and those signals propagated through whatever minimal hive mind activity remained active during the deep hibernation state the fleet had entered for its void transit. The response was gradual. An organism the size of a hive fleet does not wake quickly, but like cells in a sleeping body beginning to fire as consciousness returns, awareness propagated outward from the signal's point of entry. One organism awoke, then another, triggered by the chemical and psychic signals of the first, then another. The hive mind began to stir at its lowest possible level of activity, not the blazing collective consciousness of a fleet in mid-invasion, but something. Enough to sense the direction the signal had come from, enough to process what it implied, enough to make the adjustment that, in a biological entity of this kind, functions as a decision. The fleet changed course toward the Milky Way, and then it went back to sleep, dormant again, conserving every unit of biological energy it had for the crossing ahead. The journey would take approximately 10,000 years. The hive mind was patient in the way that only something with no concept of impatience can be patient. It made the course adjustment and returned to hibernation and drifted on its new heading, while 10,000 years of Milky Way history happened without it. While the Emperor was mortally wounded by Horus on the bridge of the vengeful spirit and placed on the Golden Throne, while the Chaos Legions were driven back to the Eye of Terror, while the Imperium slowly rebuilt from the devastation of the heresy, while the long war was fought in the shadows and the great wheels of galactic politics turned, while the Space Marine chapters fought their 1,000 different wars and the Eldar watched the galaxy from their craft worlds and the Necrons slept in their tomb worlds, while all of this was happening, the Hive fleet drifted through the dark, cold and silent, and getting closer. Then the Astronomicon became the second beacon pulling them in. As the fleet drew close enough to the galaxy's edge, the Emperor's psychic presence on the Golden Throne began to register on the hive mind's sensors. The Astronomicon blazes with a psychic energy that permeates the warp across the entire galaxy, powerful enough to be the primary navigational reference for human ships crossing the Imperium, and that same power makes it detectable at immense range to something specifically evolved to detect rich sources of biological and psychic energy. The hive mind, already heading toward the Milky Way, locked onto the Astronomicon and followed it. And the Astronomicon does not pulse and go silent the way the Pharos did. It is continuous, constant. It burns from Terra without interruption, and it has been drawing the hive fleets deeper into the galaxy, pulling them specifically toward the densest cluster of human civilization, toward the most important system in human space ever since. The thing that keeps humanity navigating the stars is also the thing directing the most dangerous predator in the universe, straight at humanity's heart. That is exactly the kind of awful, structural irony that the Warhammer 40K setting does so well. The trap woven into the salvation, the signal that saves lives, and also calls something to consume them. The implications of the Pharos event for the central question of this video are significant and worth spelling out clearly. The Tyranids were already in the void when the Pharos fired. They were already in transit, already dormant, already on a trajectory through the intergalactic dark. They were not sitting in a neighboring galaxy waiting for an invitation. They were passing through. They were already between galaxies when the signal reached them, which means they had already left wherever they last fed, and they had already been in the void for some time before the Pharos incident gave them their new heading. They were not hunting the Milky Way specifically. They found it by accident, drawn by an unexpected signal from a desperate battle they had no knowledge of and no interest in. The Night Lords and the Loyalist Space Marines fighting over a Necron navigational facility 10,000 years ago had no idea that their battle would determine which galaxy the Great Devourer targeted next. But it did. Everything that has followed, every world consumed, every billion people stripped to their component matter, every tyrannic war, is a consequence of that one overloaded signal sent by soldiers trying to survive the night. The Astronomicon's role in the invasion cannot be overstated and deserves a moment of dedicated attention because the relationship between humanity's greatest navigational tool and the Tyranid invasion is one of the setting's most uncomfortable structural ironies. The Astronomicon is the psychic beacon that the Emperor of Mankind projects from the Golden Throne on Terra through the warp. It burns with a psychic intensity, powerful enough to be detectable and navigable from most of the galaxy, guiding the navigators who pilot Imperial ships through the Imperium with a fixed reference point that does not shift or vanish. Without the Astronomicon, the Imperium of Man cannot function. Ships cannot cross interstellar distances reliably. The 10,000 worlds of the Imperium cannot be connected. The Administratum, the Astra Militarum, the supply chains that keep every world from starving or being conquered, all of it depends on ships being able to navigate, and navigation depends on the Astronomicon. It is the single most important piece of infrastructure in human space. Remove it, and the Imperium falls apart within a generation. It is also, now, a beacon that the hive mind finds irresistible and is following directly toward Terra. The same psychic energy that guides Imperial ships through the warp is being detected by the Tyranid hive mind as the signal of an extraordinarily rich and large source of biological material. The sheer number of inhabited worlds the Astronomicon represents, the tens of thousands of populated systems whose biological resources dwarf anything a single world could contain, is precisely what makes the signal appealing to the hive mind at the sensory level. The Astronomicon is, from the hive mind's biological perspective, the smell of the largest meal it has ever been offered, projected across the entire galaxy. Every navigational calculation that uses the Astronomicon to guide a ship slightly strengthens the signal reaching the hive mind. Every generation of psychers burned out, maintaining the beacon contributes to the very thing that is drawing the greatest threat to human survival, closer to the source of that survival. The Imperium cannot stop using the Astronomicon without ceasing to be the Imperium, but continuing to use it is continuing to provide the hive mind with a perfect navigation target pointing at humanity's most important location. There is no resolution to this dilemma within the current setting. The Imperium cannot turn off the Astronomicon and cannot stop the hive fleets from following it. The Mechanicus and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica have both studied the problem and arrived at the conclusion that the only alternative to the Astronomicon making the situation worse is the Astronomicon not existing. And an Imperium without the Astronomicon is not meaningfully different from the Imperium being destroyed. So, the beacon burns, and the hive fleets follow it, and the gap between the leading edge of the invasion and the heart of human space closes measurably with every passing century. The world of Tyran, where the Imperium formally first encountered the Tyranids in 745, M41, is roughly 16,000 light-years from Terra. Hive Fleet Behemoth was heading directly for the galactic core, toward the Astronomicon's source, when it was intercepted at Mekboy. Every subsequent fleet has been pushing in the same general direction. The Tyranids are not wandering the galaxy at random. They are following a signal that leads them, as if by design, to the densest concentration of human life in existence. And the people who generated that signal cannot stop generating it without destroying themselves. This is the situation. This is what the Pharos woke up and what the Astronomicon is guiding toward its source. And none of it would have happened without a decision made in desperation by soldiers who were simply trying to survive their war. The weight of consequences from a single battle in M31 is still accumulating in M42. Part 4. The Three Great Hive Fleets. The Tyranid invasion of the Milky Way is told in imperial records and strategic analyses, and the hard-won tactical doctrine developed from surviving 3 major wars and entering a 4th, through the histories of 3 primary hive fleets, Behemoth, Kraken, and Leviathan. Each one is different from the last. Each one is harder to stop than the one before. And taken together, their progression tells one of the clearest stories available in the setting about what the hive mind actually is, because the progression is exactly what you would expect from an intelligence that learns from everything and incorporates every defeat as information for the next attempt. Hive Fleet Behemoth arrived in 745, M41 from the direction of the galaxy's eastern fringe, driving inward in a single concentrated mass, close to 1,000 ships, moving together in a tight formation, pushing hard toward the galactic core in what Imperial strategists, once they understood what they were looking at, described as a battering ram. Everything Behemoth did was in service of forward momentum, one direction, maximum force, consume everything in the path, and keep moving. The worlds in Behemoth's path had almost no warning. The shadow in the warp would descend over a system, cutting off communication. Then ships sent to investigate would find nothing to investigate. Not the ruins of a battle, not distress beacons, not even wreckage from whatever defense the world had mounted, just silence, and empty rock where a populated world had been. The ocean world of Tyran was the first point where the Imperium gathered any meaningful data about what was happening, and only because Mechanicus personnel managed to get a data slate onto an outgoing ship before the consumption was complete. Inquisitor Cryptman spent years turning that data into the first Imperial understanding of what a Tyranid hive fleet was. He named the threat, he classified it, he activated every resource available to him and issued warnings to every authority who would listen and some who wouldn't, and he did all of this while watching world after world go silent behind him as Behemoth drove on. Behemoth was heading for Mekboy, the homeworld of the Ultramarines, one of the most heavily fortified and strategically significant worlds in the Ultima Segmentum. Whether the fleet was drawn to it specifically by intelligence about its importance, or simply by the density of biological resources on and around a heavily populated Space Marine homeworld, it came with everything it had. The Battle of Mekboy was catastrophic in its cost, even in victory. The Ultramarines' first company, 200 veterans of more campaigns than many chapters have years of existence, died to the last warrior holding the polar fortresses, while Chapter Master Marneus Calgar fought the fleet from orbit. They did not retreat. They did not break. They held their positions against wave after wave of Tyranid bioforms, assault waves that came without pause and without fatigue and without any of the psychological factors that would eventually erode a human defender's ability to maintain discipline in extended combat. The Tyranids did not feel the weight of hours on them. They did not feel the cumulative exhaustion of sustained fighting. They attacked because the hive mind directed them to attack, and they continued attacking until the direction changed. The first company was destroyed, every single one of them. Their gene seed was recovered by the apothecaries, their genetic legacy preserved in the chapter's stocks, their sacrifice memorialized in every Ultramarines tradition that followed. But the men themselves were gone, the most experienced warriors the chapter possessed, the veterans who carried in their memories and their reflexes, the accumulated wisdom of generations of close combat expertise, were consumed fighting an enemy that would take what it had learned from killing them and apply it to killing the next defenders it encountered. The fleet was broken in orbit, its ships destroyed in a killing ground that the combined firepower of the Ultramarines fleet and the Imperial Navy established at the cost of the chapter's finest. But broken is not the same as destroyed. Splinter fleets from Behemoth continued appearing in the eastern fringe for standard centuries. The hive mind salvaged whatever it could, even in defeat. And everything it learned at Mekboy, every tactic Calgar had used, every weakness in the fleet's approach that had been exploited, was absorbed and processed. Which is why Hive Fleet Kraken, arriving in 993, M41, did everything differently. Where Behemoth had been a fist, Kraken was a hand with far too many fingers and more sprouting constantly. It split itself into dozens, then hundreds of separate tendrils, before it ever made contact with the outer systems. Each tendril, a self-sufficient invasion force, capable of consuming worlds independently. The result was a front that the Imperium could not defend conventionally. You cannot mass your forces against 100 simultaneous attacks without leaving 100 other places undefended. Any concentration of defenders creates a gap that another tendril can exploit. Any success in stopping one tendril means that one closes while the others continue their work. Kraken was devastating across an enormous sweep of the eastern fringe and beyond. Craft World Eondon, the great Eldar vessel world, came the closest it has ever come to total destruction. The Eldar there fought with everything they had, emptying their military capacity so completely that even victories left them weaker than before, the cost always exceeding what they could sustainably absorb. They survived, barely. Their population did not recover to anything like its pre-Kraken level as of the current setting. The Second Tyrannic War was halted, not ended. Marneus Calgar broke the main body of Kraken at HR4, applying everything learned from Macrag while developing entirely new doctrine for the challenges Kraken posed. But breaking Kraken's main body scattered its tendrils rather than recalling them. There was no central signal to send a retreat order. The splinters continued. They are still active. There are Kraken splinter fleets operating in the galaxy as of the most current lore, and they will likely remain active for generations. Then Leviathan, and Leviathan represented a qualitative jump, not just an incremental improvement. It arrived in 997, M41, only 4 years after Kraken, and its first innovation was directional. It came not from the east, where every previous fleet had come from, but from below, from beneath the galactic plane, surging upward from the galactic south in two massive arms arranged to close around a section of the galaxy like jaws. The two-pronged approach was designed to achieve encirclement, to sever warp routes between the targeted regions and the rest of the Imperium, to isolate entire sectors before the shadow and the warp descended on them, ensuring that the worlds about to be consumed were cut off from reinforcement or evacuation before they even knew they needed either. Inquisitor Cryptman, the same man who had first identified Behemoth decades before, recognized the pattern. He implemented the Cryptman census, burning out astropaths across hundreds of worlds in a desperate cartographic exercise to map the invasion's shape before the shadow silenced them all permanently. The picture that emerged was enough to shake anyone who saw it. Leviathan was larger than Behemoth and Kraken combined, by a margin that defied easy comprehension. Leviathan struck at Baal, the home system of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters, who gathered there from across the galaxy to stand together in the knowledge that if Baal fell, there would be nothing meaningful left to fall back to. The account in Guy Haley's novel Devastation of Baal is the closest thing to a Tyranid horror story that the fiction has produced. The Blood Angels fought not with hope of victory, but with the specific purpose of making the defeat as expensive as possible for the hive mind, of grinding down as much of Leviathan's mass as possible before the end came. Chapter Master Dante looked into the eyes of the Swarm Lord in that battle, perceived the soul of the hive mind directly, and what he found was not power or triumph. He found hunger so deep and so absolute that he pitied it. The red thirst, the Blood Angels' own terrible curse, the psychic flaw that drives them toward bloodlust and threatens to tip them into the state they call the Black Rage, was trivial compared to what he saw in that moment. The hive mind hungered in a way that made everything the Blood Angels struggled with look like a minor inconvenience. What saved Baal, at least in the short term, was not military achievement but cosmic accident. The Great Rift tore open. The galaxy-spanning warp scar that defines the current era of the setting erupted during Leviathan's assault on Baal, and the raw immaterium that poured through it struck the Tyranid fleet. Chaos and Tyranids are antithetical at a fundamental level. The warp provides nothing the hive mind can use. The psychic forces that spilled through the rift disrupted the biological systems the fleet depended on in ways that weapons had not managed to achieve on the same scale. Leviathan was thrown into disarray. It withdrew, adapted, and resumed the war in new configurations. But the moment of disruption was enough. Leviathan did not end. It is the driver of the Fourth Tyrannic War in the current setting, and it arrives now with everything 3 full waves of contact with the Milky Way's defenders have taught the hive mind. Every tactic that worked against Behemoth, every exploitation of Kraken's vulnerabilities, every advantage that saved lives in the Third Tyrannic War, the hive mind has absorbed and countered. The war being fought now is the hardest one yet, and the hive mind is still learning. Other named hive fleets are worth noting in brief because they fill out the picture. Hive Fleet Gorgon came later and drove into the realm of the Tau Empire, and its defeat there was notable because the Tau's Firecast, with their highly adaptive combined arms tactics and their ability to coordinate rapid defensive reconfiguration, managed to achieve something the Imperium had not. They broke Gorgon at enormous cost, losing significant territory and populations. But the cost the hive mind extracted from them in information about their tactical methods was something the Tau have no way to know they paid. Hive Fleet Jormungandr is notable for its characteristic of approaching target worlds not from above, but through the rock itself, tunneling through the crust of worlds to attack from below and inside. Hive Fleet Hydra is known for mimicking the tactics of the enemies it encounters, something the hive mind has theoretically always been capable of, but that Hydra expresses with particular tactical sophistication. Hive Fleet Kronos was apparently developed specifically as the hive mind's answer to the warp and chaos, a fleet configured specifically for suppressing psychic activity and destroying warp-touched targets. Its existence tells you that the hive mind looked at the Great Rift as a problem and engineered a solution to it. Each fleet is a different face of the same intelligence. Each one addresses a challenge that previous fleets identified. The hive mind is not sending wave after wave of the same attack hoping it will eventually work. It is running experiments. Each wave is more refined than the last. The Milky Way's defenders have been winning battles. They may be winning individual engagements for as long as any of them live, but every victory teaches the hive mind something, and the something it learns becomes the next generation of threat that those defenders' children and grandchildren will have to face. There is a dimension of the three-fleet progression that is easy to miss when you are focused on the tactical specifics of each engagement. It is the dimension of what the progression tells us about the hive mind's relationship to the Milky Way as a whole, separate from the question of what drove it here. By the time Leviathan arrived in 997, M41, the hive mind had spent roughly 10,000 years observing this galaxy. Its vanguard organisms had been here for a significant portion of that period. Its genestealer infiltrators had penetrated Imperial worlds, Eldar craft worlds, Ork-held territories, and likely other inhabited locations that never reported the infiltration because they had no surviving population to do the reporting. The hive mind had collected enormous amounts of data about every species it had encountered and about their defensive capabilities, tactical doctrines, psychological weaknesses, and social structures. Leviathan was built from all of that information. Its tactical configurations were not improvised responses to problems Behemoth and Kraken had encountered. They were the product of comprehensive pre-invasion analysis of everything the hive mind scouts had observed across 10,000 years of careful watching. The direction of approach from below the galactic plane was not random. It was specifically chosen because analysis of the Milky Way's defensive architecture identified the galactic south as the region with the largest gap in coherent defensive coverage, the area where the fewest Imperial facilities were positioned, the direction from which an invasion could advance furthest before encountering the kind of concentrated resistance that had stopped Behemoth. The two-pronged jaw configuration was not an evolutionary response to Behemoth's defeat at Macragge. It was a strategic doctrine derived from observing how the Imperium had successfully defended against Behemoth and Kraken, and identifying that the key factor in both defenses was the ability to concentrate forces against a predictable axis of advance. Two simultaneous axes, separated by thousands of light years, prevents that concentration. The hive mind had concluded this before Leviathan's first ship crossed into Imperial space. This means the escalation from Behemoth to Kraken to Leviathan was not purely reactive evolution. It was also planned development. The hive mind was designing future invasions based on predictive analysis of the Milky Way's response patterns throughout the entire period since the Pharos incident. The vanguard organisms sent ahead of the main fleets were not just feeding, they were studying, mapping, transmitting everything they observed back through the synapse network to a hive mind that was doing strategic planning on a timescale measured in millennia. By the time Behemoth arrived, the hive mind already knew, at least partially, what it was going to do with Kraken. By the time Kraken arrived, it already had a significant basis for Leviathan's design. The apparent escalation of threat across three waves was not the hive mind learning and improving in response to defeats. It was the hive mind executing a plan it had been developing since the Pharos lit up in M31. The practical implication of this is unsettling. The hive fleets already in the Milky Way, devastating as they have been, are not the hive mind at its best. They are early operations, the initial waves of a process that becomes more refined with every generation. Whatever follows Leviathan, whatever the hive mind's strategic analysis of the Fourth Tyrannic War produces as the basis for the next wave, will be designed with knowledge of everything the galaxy's defenders have used to survive so far. Every tactic that works against Leviathan is a tactic the next generation of hive fleets will already have planned countermeasures for before they arrive. The learning is asymmetric and always will be. Part 5. The Genestealer Vanguard. The invasion often begins long before the fleet arrives, decades before, sometimes centuries. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of how the Tyranids operate, and one that people who know the faction, primarily through its military aspects, often underestimate, because it means that the worlds the hive fleet targets are frequently already compromised, already infiltrated, already being consumed from the inside, before a single spore pod falls from the sky. The vanguard organism is the Genestealer, a creature that combines the physical lethality of a frontline Tyranid bioform with a subtlety and patience that most Tyranid organisms do not need, because they are not deployed in advance of the fleet. The Genestealer travels ahead, alone or in very small numbers, hitching passage on ships, hiding in cargo holds and maintenance shafts, moving between worlds along the trade routes and military supply lines that connect the Imperium systems. It goes first. It goes quietly, and when it arrives somewhere inhabited, it does not immediately attack. It infects. The infection process is body horror of a particular and precise kind. The Genestealer seeks out isolated individuals, people whose absence will not be immediately noticed or whose sudden change in behavior can be accommodated or explained within normal social parameters. Workers in the industrial underbelly of a hive city, deep in the sublevels where Arbite's patrols are sparse, and anomalous behavior has many possible innocent explanations. Travelers passing through remote waypoints, anyone who can be abducted briefly, changed, and returned to their life before anyone important notices. The Genestealer implants them with its own genetic material. This begins rewriting the victim's reproductive biology and altering their neurology in ways that produce a very specific psychological state. The infected person returns to their life apparently unchanged. They go back to their family, their work, their prayers, and routines. But they now feel, with a completeness and clarity that overrides most other considerations, an absolute devotion to the creature that changed them. Love, if the word can be stretched to cover something, this total and this unchosen. The Genestealer that infected them is their purpose now. The propagation of what it represents is their mission, and they feel compelled to share this purpose with the people they love. The children born to infected individuals are hybrids. First and second generation hybrids carry obvious Tyranid features, the extra limbs, the cranial ridges, the skin textures, and proportions that mark them immediately as something other than human. They cannot pass in public, they are hidden, raised in the darkness of the cult that forms around the original Genestealer, a cult that provides them with a theological framework for their existence. They are special. They are the bridge. The saviors from the stars that their theology describes are coming, and when those saviors arrive, the faithful will be elevated beyond anything the ordinary world can offer. Over subsequent generations, the hybrids become more human-looking. By the third and fourth generation, many can pass with sufficient clothing and careful behavior management. By this point, the cult may have been growing for 50 or 100 or even 200 years. Its members are now distributed through the social fabric of the world at every level. They are in the workforce. They are in law enforcement. They are in the civil administration. Some have risen to positions of authority, and all of them, across all of their apparent ordinary lives, remain networked through the psychic link that the Genestealer Patriarch, the original or a later generation creature that has grown enormous with accumulated psychic power, maintains over every member of the congregation. The Patriarch's psychic signal grows as the cult grows. More minds in the network means more psychic resonance, means a stronger beacon, and that beacon, reaching through the warp across interstellar distances, is detectable by the hive mind as the signature of a pre-weakened target. A world with an active cult is a world that will fall faster and more completely than a world that must be conquered from scratch. The hive fleet adjusts its course toward the signal. When the fleet is close enough, the shadow in the warp descends, and in that moment, the cult members who have lived their entire lives waiting for exactly this receive a signal they feel in their genes, the call to rise. The uprising is coordinated and devastating. Infrastructure targeted for destruction has been mapped. Commanders identified as the most capable defenders are killed in the first hours by people who have had years to learn their patterns and security. Arms caches that cult members have spent years quietly building or positioning themselves near are seized. The planetary defense forces find themselves fighting an enemy that knows every weakness in their dispositions, every fallback position, every encrypted channel, every emergency protocol, because those enemies built their careers inside the defense system. The world comes apart from the inside at exactly the moment when holding together is the only thing that could save it. And then the fleet arrives. The most devastating thing about the Genestealer cult as a narrative device is what happens to the cult members themselves when the fleet comes. Every cult, on every world, has the same belief at its core. When the fleet arrives, the faithful will be rewarded. The saviors from the stars that they have devoted their lives to will recognize the sacrifice and the service, and elevate the believers to something greater. This is what the Patriarch's psychic influence encourages. This is what the cult theology teaches. The cultists believe it with the conviction of people whose entire identity is built on it. The hive fleet consumes them with everything else. The biomass conversion process does not have a category for valued allies. The Tyranids have no concept of reward or recognition or loyalty to anything outside the hive mind. The humans who spent generations infiltrating, risking imprisonment and death, raising their strange hybrid children in the darkness, fighting and killing for the hive, believing with absolute sincerity in the coming of their saviors, are stripped down to their molecules alongside everyone else. The hive mind does not remember them, does not honor them, does not spare them. They were always biomass. Every cult on every world ends the same way, with the believers consumed by the gods they worshipped. It is perhaps the only faction in the setting whose members are genuinely victims, even as they commit acts of terrible violence, because their minds were altered without their consent, and their devotion is real, even if its object is utterly indifferent to their existence. The Genestealer infiltration strategy, taken as a whole, reveals something important about how the hive mind thinks about time. The cycle from a lone gene stealer arriving on a world to a full cult uprising and the fleet's arrival can take anywhere from several decades to several centuries. The hive mind plants these seeds without knowing precisely when they will bloom or what specific world conditions will look like when the fleet arrives. It has no way to synchronize the uprising with the fleet's arrival with the precision of a clock, and yet it works consistently because the beacon that the cult's growing psychic presence generates is precisely the mechanism by which the fleet is drawn. The fleet does not arrive on a preset schedule. It arrives when the beacon is strong enough to pull it in, and the beacon becomes strong enough when the cult has grown large and active enough to broadcast at the necessary intensity. This means the system is self-regulating. Worlds that prove easier to infiltrate, whose societies are more porous, whose institutions are more corrupt or neglected, produce stronger and faster-growing cults, which generate stronger beacons sooner, which attract fleet attention more quickly. Worlds that are harder to infiltrate, more vigilant, more resistant to corruption, produce slower-growing or less successful cults, which generate weaker beacons, which attract less fleet attention or take longer to attract it. The hive mind does not make individual decisions about prioritizing worlds for invasion. The worlds that generate the strongest signals get the fleet first, and that means the worlds most vulnerable to the infiltration cycle are the ones that fall soonest. There is an uncomfortable implication here for the Imperium's internal governance. The corruption, neglect, and social stratification that the Imperium's own structure produces at a systemic level, the grinding poverty of the underhive, the bureaucratic indifference that leaves large populations invisible to the institutions that nominally protect them, the spiritual desperation that makes people susceptible to an alternative theology that promises them belonging and purpose and cosmic meaning, all of this is precisely what Genestealer cults are adapted to exploit. The Imperium's internal dysfunction does not just make it harder to respond to Tyranid threats. It actively makes those threats worse by creating exactly the social conditions in which Genestealer cults thrive most readily. The Death Watch, the elite Xenos hunting space marine organization that emerged partly in response to the Tyrannic Wars, has developed the most sophisticated institutional knowledge of Genestealer cult identification and elimination in the Imperium. Their kill teams are specifically trained to recognize the generational signatures of cult infiltration, the subtle physical markers that distinguish hybrid generations, the behavioral patterns that indicate psychic cult membership, the infrastructure signs that suggest an active patriarch in a region. They are very good at what they do. And the Death Watch has found cults on worlds that had no idea they were infiltrated, had no reports of unusual activity, had no records of unexplained disappearances or strange new religious movements, and the cults found there were already in their third or fourth generation. This is the practical meaning of centuries of infiltration. By the time you have the tools to look for a cult, the earliest generations of cults that survived undetected are old enough that their members look entirely human and occupy entirely respectable positions. The Death Watch finds what it finds. What it does not find is almost certainly more. Every world in the Imperium that has had any contact with interstellar trade routes, any history of travelers or migrant workers or refugees passing through, any period of reduced Arbite's oversight during the countless upheavals of the 41st and 42nd millennia, is a world where a gene stealer may have arrived and begun the infection cycle without anyone noticing. Some of those worlds have been found and cleansed. The majority, statistically, have not been found. They are out there, incubating, growing, waiting for the call. Part 6. A Galaxy Already Eaten. Here, the exploration moves from what the lore explicitly tells us into what it implies, and the implications built into the canonical sources are staggering enough to deserve careful attention. The Lexicanum, which compiles lore from official Games Workshop publications across decades, contains a statement that is easy to scroll past without registering its full weight. According to at least one official source, the Tyranids have consumed 1,000 galaxies and are responsible for the annihilation of millions of intelligent species. 1,000 galaxies. The Milky Way, with its hundreds of billions of stars, and the civilizations that have risen and fallen within it across billions of years, the Eldar at the height of their ancient empire, the Old Ones in their prime, every species that has ever reached for the stars within this galaxy, is one entry on a list that is already 1,000 items long. The 40K setting does not maintain perfect consistency across all its publications. Numbers get revised. Some older claims are superseded by newer sources. So we hold that figure loosely, as an order of magnitude rather than a precise count. But even held loosely, even taken as a rough sense of scale rather than an auditable figure, what it implies is extraordinary. The Tyranids are not a recent development in the universe. They are ancient, possibly as ancient as any intelligent life in the setting, and they have been doing this exact process of locating galaxy-level food sources and consuming them for longer than the Milky Way's oldest civilizations have existed. One of the most significant pieces of spatial evidence is the directions from which the various hive fleets approach. Hive Fleet Behemoth came from the galactic east. Hive Fleet Kraken came from the eastern fringe, but at a different angle. Hive Fleet Leviathan came from below the galactic plane. From the galactic south, other named fleets approach from still other directions. If all the Tyranids were originating from a single nearby galaxy, or a single point in the intergalactic void, you would expect them to approach the Milky Way from a single general direction. The fact that they arrive from multiple different directions simultaneously implies that the Tyranid presence in the intergalactic void surrounding the Milky Way is not a single fleet at a single location, but something distributed across place. An enormous volume of space, approaching from all sides, with the named hive fleets representing whatever portions of the total are currently closest to the galaxy's rim. The spatial picture this produces, if you think about it carefully, is not of an army marching from one direction. It is of an encirclement. The Milky Way is surrounded, not by a wall, but by a distributed biological presence so vast that parts of it are in contact from every compass point. The named hive fleets are the front-runners. What follows them is still in the void. The mathematical analysis of the Pharos event timeline produces another dimension of this picture. The Tyranids were in the void when the Pharos fired, somewhere in the intergalactic dark. The nearest major galaxy to the Milky Way is Andromeda, approximately 2.5 million light-years distant. If the Tyranids were crossing from something in that range, and were roughly 100,000 light-years from the Milky Way's rim when the Pharos reached them, And if their travel speed is sufficient to cover that distance in something like 10,000 years, then the last time they consumed anything was an extraordinary span of time before the Pharos incident. Tens of thousands of years before recorded human history. They have been in transit, without food, for a duration that defies easy comprehension. This is the context in which the urgency and relentlessness of every Tyranid incursion must be understood. The hive mind was not attacking the Milky Way from a position of strength or comfort. It was attacking from the biological equivalent of extreme deprivation. Every world consumed, every organism harvested, every kilogram of biomass processed and converted is not just fuel for the next wave. It is the relief of a hunger that had been building for a span of time before human civilization began. The speed with which the Tyranids adapt and the aggression with which they pursue every available food source is not the behavior of an apex predator comfortable in its dominance. It is the behavior of something that has been without food for longer than it should have been, attacking the first meal it has found with everything it has. This also raises a pointed question. If the Tyranids were in transit between food sources, when the Pharos reached them, that means they had left their previous food source before arriving here. And the hive mind does not leave a food source before it is finished. So either their previous galaxy was completely consumed, every world stripped to bare rock, which would mean that another galaxy in the local group is already silent and dark, or something interrupted them before they were finished. Something made them leave early, made them abandon the remaining food and transit to somewhere else, made them willing to cross millions of light years of empty space rather than continue consuming what they had access to. A species that has been doing this for 1 billion years does not leave food on the table by accident. If they left early, something made them. The Lexicanum also contains this, drawn from official sources, that each of the different Tyranid hive fleets has approached the Milky Way from a different direction, which may imply that the Tyranids have consumed a disturbingly large number of nearby galaxies. The word disturbingly in that sentence is doing a lot of work. It is the clinical language of an imperial source trying to frame a conclusion that, if stated plainly, would be that the local group of galaxies, the gravitationally bound collection of roughly 60 or more galaxies that the Milky Way belongs to, may already be essentially lifeless everywhere except here. The stars of those galaxies are still burning. The planets are still there, still orbiting, still conducting their silent geological processes across geological time, but nothing lives on any of them. Everything that ever grew or moved or breathed or thought on any of those worlds is now inside the Tyranid genetic library, cataloged and assessed and either incorporated into new bioforms or discarded as redundant. Millions of species, thousands of civilizations, some of them possibly as advanced or more advanced than anything the Milky Way has produced. Gone, not destroyed, consumed. That is a specific and particular kind of horror. Things that are destroyed leave ruins. Ruins can tell you that something was there. They have a certain dignity in the evidence of their existence. Consumption leaves nothing. Not even the knowledge that something was there. The universe itself does not remember what the Tyranids have eaten, because the universe has no mechanism for memory. Only the Tyranid genetic library holds the residue of those vanished civilizations, encoded in DNA sequences that the hive mind has incorporated and would not be able to explain or attribute, even if it were the kind of entity that offered explanations. There is one more dimension of the consumed galaxy picture that has not been fully explored, and that connects directly to the question of what the Tyranids might be running from. It concerns the nature of what the hive mind takes away from each galaxy it consumes beyond just the biological matter. The genetic library of the Tyranids is not simply a collection of raw material, it is a record, an accidental archive. Every species the hive mind has ever consumed exists within the hive's genetic heritage as a set of encoded sequences. And while the hive mind does not preserve those sequences as conscious knowledge the way a library preserves books, they exist there as biological information. The DNA of a species is not just the instructions for building that species' body. It is a compressed history of every environment that species ever adapted to, every challenge it ever survived, every evolutionary pressure that shaped it over millions of years. The hive mind, by absorbing the genetic heritage of millions of species across 1,000 galaxies, has accumulated within its own biology the encoded histories of those species' worlds. Not in any form that could be read as history, not in any form that would allow a researcher to reconstruct what those civilizations were like, or what they valued, or what they built. But the history is there, compressed and encoded in DNA sequences that no one in the Milky Way has the technology or knowledge to decode, even if they could access the genetic archives of a hive fleet, which they cannot. Every intelligent species that ever existed in the galaxies the Tyranids have consumed, every civilization that rose and fell in those places, left its mark in the hive mind's genetic library. Those civilizations may have been extraordinary. Some of them were certainly older than anything in the Milky Way. Some of them may have solved problems that the Milky Way's current species are still struggling with. Some of them may have encountered the Tyranids themselves, resisted for as long as they could, developed defenses and weapons and strategies, and eventually been consumed. And everything they developed in that resistance was absorbed into the hive mind's understanding of how to overcome resistance, which is itself part of what makes subsequent waves of Tyranid invasion more dangerous. The most terrible possibility within this picture is not that those civilizations are gone. It is that their last act, the act of resisting the Tyranids as long as they could, directly contributed to the ability of the Tyranids to destroy the next civilization they encountered. The noble resistance of a species that fought to the last world made the hive mind better at consuming the next species. The courage of those defenders, translated through the mechanism of the hive mind's adaptive learning, became a weapon used against everything that came after. This is the shape of despair that the Tyranid threat produces when you follow its logic all the way to its end. It is not that fighting is pointless. It is that the cost of fighting is borne by the fighters, while the benefits of what the fighters teach the hive mind are reaped by the hive mind's future targets. Every battle the Milky Way's defenders win teaches the hive mind something. Every tactical innovation, every doctrine developed, every weapon designed to counter Tyranid bioforms, all of it eventually gets incorporated into the dataset that shapes the next generation of the invasion. That knowledge does not make fighting wrong. The alternative to fighting is being consumed immediately, and consuming immediately still contributes to the hive mind's resources and gives the next target no additional time at all. Delay is still worth purchasing. Every generation that survives is a generation that lived. But the full picture of what fighting the Tyranids costs and what it produces is darker than most accounts of the Tyrannic Wars acknowledge. Part 7. The Silent King's Warning. Of all the pieces of lore that bear on the central question, the most significant belongs to the Necrons, specifically to Sarek, the Silent King, who is the only named character in the current setting who has actually been outside the galaxy during the relevant period, and who has explicitly encountered the Tyranids in the intergalactic void before they arrived here. He is the only witness, and he came back, and he will not say exactly what he saw. Sarek's story is one of the setting's great long arcs, and its full weight requires understanding who he was before he became what he is. He was the last ruler of the Necrontyr, the mortal race that became the Necrons. The Necrontyr were a civilization defined by suffering, their homeworld bathed in lethal radiation from their star, their lives brief and painful, and full of the resentment that short life and continuous death breeds over millennia. They were brilliant engineers, driven to achieve in the time available what longer-lived species could do at leisure, and their greatest achievement was also their greatest catastrophe. They made a deal with the Citan, the star gods, beings of immense and ancient power who saw in the Necrontyr a species they could use. The Citan offered the Necrontyr immortality through biotransference, the transfer of Necrontyr consciousness from biological bodies into indestructible frames of living metal. The Necrontyr accepted. They became the Necrons, undying and eternal, and in the process they lost their souls. The warmth and passion and emotional complexity that had made them alive was stripped out. They were left running, functional and immortal and empty, their consciousness intact, but their inner life gone, replaced by cold mechanical purpose in bodies that could not feel pleasure or pain, or the particular texture of being alive that makes immortality worth having. Sarek understood what had happened. He had authorized biotransference. He had brought his people into the arrangement, believing the Citan's promises, failing to understand until too late what the actual price was. After the Necrons overthrew their C'tan masters in a great uprising, Sarek made the only act of penance available to him. He had his 2 fellow Triarchs killed. And then he exiled himself from the galaxy, departing alone into the intergalactic void, carrying the weight of what he had done to his entire species, seeking some way across the unimaginable span of time ahead of him to find a path back to what had been lost. He was outside the galaxy for approximately 60 million years. During that time, wandering the void between galaxies, he encountered the Tyranids. The lore does not detail what this encounter looked like. It does not tell us how close he came to the fleet, what he observed of the hive mind's nature and behavior during his observation, what specific capabilities he recognized in the organisms he encountered. What he concluded from whatever evidence of their history and scale he was able to gather during 60 million years of proximity and observation. What the lore tells us is the outcome. He encountered the Tyranids. He recognized the threat they posed. He decided to return to the Milky Way, and he committed himself to preventing the hive mind from consuming everything in the galaxy. His stated motivation is clear. The Necrons' dream of reversing biotransference, of eventually finding a way to return to organic existence, depends on there being organic life in the galaxy. If the Tyranids consume everything, that dream becomes permanently impossible. The galaxy would be stripped. There would be no suitable biological material to study, no species to eventually adapt for use as vessels for Necron consciousness, no path back. The Necrons would be what they are, forever, with no possibility of recourse. To protect that possibility, Sarek fights the Tyranids. This is the canonical reason. It is clearly stated in the lore, and it makes complete sense as a motivation. But what is not stated, and what the lore pointedly and deliberately omits, is what Sarek actually understands about the Tyranids from 60 million years of exile that included direct observation of them in the void. What context that experience gave him about what they are, where they truly came from, what they have been doing, what might be behind them, or what drove them to be what they are. All of that he keeps to himself. The lore notes specifically that Necrons who press Sarek too hard on the details of his exile are taken away by Triarch Praetorians and never seen again. The question is not permitted. The information is too sensitive, or too large, or too dangerous to distribute, and the Silent King has decided that the right response to possessing it is to act on it quietly, rather than to share it with anyone whose response to the information might reduce, rather than enhance the galaxy's chances of survival. Think about what that silence implies. Sarek is a being of extraordinary intelligence, with 60 million years of continuous existence and direct observation of the hive mind. During a period when no one else in the galaxy knew the Tyranids existed, he came back. He is building. He is fighting the Tyranids, forging the kind of alliances that no Necron overlord would consider without extreme motivation. He made common cause with Blood Angel Space Marines against Tyranids in the Gehenna campaign, an event that would in any other context be a simple battle between Necrons and Space Marines treated as an afterthought. Instead, it was a joint operation, because both parties recognized the Tyranids as the threat that outweighed everything else in that moment. That flexibility is not the behavior of someone who saw something small. The Silent King does not work with other factions. His default is manipulation from a distance, shaping events through intermediaries, never revealing his hand, never committing resources he doesn't have to. The Gehenna campaign represents a departure from that pattern, and departures from deep pattern in beings who have had 60 million years to entrench their habits represent significant force acting on them. Whatever Sarek saw in the void changed him from someone completing a journey of personal penance into someone with a specific urgent mission. He came home because the Tyranids were coming, and he understood what that meant, at a level no one else in the galaxy does. And he sealed that understanding away from everyone else, because whatever it contains, it is not something he is willing to let become common knowledge. The closest thing to a witness the setting has, and he is not talking. What we can observe about Sarek's behavior in the galaxy since his return, though, provides a kind of indirect testimony about what he found. Not what he saw specifically, but the shape of how seriously he takes it. Sarek does not form alliances. That is a statement about his deep character and consistent behavior across all the lore that covers him. He manipulates, he positions. He shapes events from behind layers of distance and deniability. He sends proxies. He offers information to unwitting intermediaries, who then act on it without knowing the source. This is not simply tactical caution. It reflects a fundamental orientation toward the Necrons as an entity operating on a different level from the younger races, an entity that does not need alliances because it does not need help in the conventional sense, only time and the right conditions. The Gehenna campaign is a documented exception to this pattern. Sarek's Necron forces fought directly alongside Blood Angel Space Marines against a Tyranid threat on a specific world. The Blood Angels are among the most famous of the Space Marine chapters. They are also, from any Necron strategic perspective, a resource to be managed and eventually co-opted or removed as the Necrons reassert dominance over the galaxy. The notion of Sarek's forces fighting in direct coordination with Blood Angels, recognizing them as allies rather than as tools or future obstacles, is genuinely anomalous. The only framework that explains it is that the Tyranid threat at Gehenna was assessed as more immediately significant than all other strategic considerations, not more significant than the overall plan, not more significant than the long-term Necron goal of reclaiming the galaxy, but more significant than maintaining the operational distance and plausible deniability that normally characterize Sarek's methods. The threat was immediate enough and serious enough that the calculus shifted, and fighting openly alongside Space Marines became preferable to whatever outcome the alternative would have produced. That calculus, made by a being with 60 million years of observational experience and the specific knowledge he gathered during his exile in the void where the Tyranids dwell, is a data point. It does not tell us what Sarek saw. It tells us that what he saw was sufficient to produce that willingness to break from his established patterns. There is another data point worth noting. Sarek has been working to awaken Necron dynasties across the galaxy, preparing his people for a conflict he understands is coming. He has been doing this carefully and selectively, awakening dynasties that he judges ready and capable, leaving others to their slumber a while longer. This is long-term preparation on a galactic scale, carried out by someone who genuinely believes the threat justifies it. The scale of that preparation says something about the scale of the threat, as Sarek understands it. He is not preparing for a single campaign or a single hive fleet. He is preparing the entire Necron species for a confrontation with something that he believes requires the full available strength of the most ancient and technologically advanced civilization the galaxy has ever produced. He is building toward a war, and the war he is building toward is the war with the Tyranids. Whatever he saw in the void, it showed him that war was necessary, and that the time to prepare was now, before the main body of what is coming arrives, because after it arrives, the time for preparation will be past. The Silent King is the most informed individual in the setting on the question of what the Tyranids are and where they come from. His silence on the details is the loudest thing about him. Part 8. Theories: what could they be running from? The question of whether the Tyranids are fleeing something or simply following their hunger is one the setting has never resolved. Games Workshop has maintained deliberate ambiguity, and that ambiguity has been productive because it has allowed the community to develop theories that, whatever their canonical accuracy, illuminate the nature of the setting and the nature of cosmic horror in ways worth exploring seriously. There are 5 main theories worth examining in detail, ranging from the most dramatically satisfying to the most philosophically disturbing. The first theory is that the Tyranids are fleeing another hive mind. The logic is this: if the process that produced the Tyranids, some initial biological organism that developed a collective consciousness and the capacity to consume and adapt from everything it ate, and then followed that capacity to its logical conclusion across galactic scales, if that process is physically possible within the laws of the universe, there is no particular reason to assume it happened only once. The universe is 13.8 billion years old, and is essentially infinite in the scales relevant to this discussion. The conditions that produced the Tyranids could have occurred elsewhere, perhaps many times, perhaps across different galaxies or different regions of the same galaxy at different points in cosmic history. If 2 hive minds ever came into direct contact, the resulting conflict would operate at a level that defeats ordinary description. 2 vast biological superorganisms, each built from billions of years of accumulated evolutionary experience across multiple galaxies, each capable of absorbing and adapting from whatever it encounters, competing for the same biological resources in the same space. Neither side would experience the conflict the way individual organisms experience war. It would be more like two immune systems encountering each other, each learning from every contact, each incorporating what it learned into the next wave, each pushing to consume the other and absorbing the information of every failed attempt into the next effort. The theory suggests the Tyranids we know lost this conflict, or found themselves outmatched at the current balance of forces in a way that made continuation untenable. And so the hive mind did the only thing available to something of its nature that cannot accept annihilation. It fled, crossed the void, find a new galaxy, consume enough biomass to rebuild what was lost, or surpass what had outcompeted it, come back stronger, or simply establish a new presence somewhere that the rival hive mind has not reached. This theory has genuine narrative appeal because it provides the Tyranid invasion with a structural logic that goes beyond simple hunger. The relentlessness with which the hive fleets consume, the urgency that drives every engagement, the sense that the Tyranids cannot afford to slow down or be turned back or spend too long on any single objective. All of this reads differently if you understand it as the behavior of something that needs to rebuild as fast as possible, because something is still out there that posed a genuine threat to it. The problem is that this theory has essentially no direct support in the official lore. There is nothing in any canonical source that describes a second hive mind or suggests that the Tyranids have encountered a rival biological superorganism. The hive mind's behavior does not include any element that clearly indicates fear of pursuit. It does not look over its shoulder. Its tactical decisions are entirely forward-facing. If it has a rival, that rival has not communicated itself to the lore in any detectable way. The second theory is more grounded in existing lore elements. It proposes that what the Tyranids are fleeing is chaos. Within the Milky Way, chaos and Tyranids appear to be separate threats, operating in parallel rather than in direct conflict. They avoid each other more than they fight. Tyranid fleets tend to skirt regions of heavy warp activity, and the shadow in the warp that a hive fleet projects actually suppresses warp activity in its immediate vicinity, meaning the two forces naturally separate rather than collide. They are antithetical at a fundamental biological and metaphysical level. The warp provides no nutrition for the hive mind. Chaos entities and psychic forces are actively disruptive to the biological systems the hive mind depends on. They do not mix. But scale this up. The chaos gods are sustained by psychic energy, generated by living, thinking, feeling beings. Every mortal creature in the galaxy that experiences emotion, every prayer and every fear, and every moment of passion or despair, contributes in some infinitesimal way to the power of the beings in the Imperium. The relationship between organic life and chaos is symbiotic at the most fundamental level. Each requires the other to be what it is. Now consider what happens to that relationship if the Tyranids succeed completely. If every living thing in the galaxy is consumed, the source of chaos's power goes dark. A galaxy stripped clean of biological life generates no psychic energy. The warp it mirrors would become still. The chaos gods, whatever the precise nature of their existence, would experience this as starvation of their power source on a galactic scale. The theory extends this logic back to whatever galaxy the Tyranids came from. In that galaxy, the chaos entities that existed in its Imperium, however they might differ from the ruinous powers of our warp, would have faced exactly this situation as the Tyranids consumed more and more of that galaxy's biological life. At some point, confronted with the threat of their own extinction from deprivation, those entities mobilized. They struck back at the hive mind, using tools that the hive mind's biological architecture has no defense against. Raw warp energy, psychic assault at a scale the Imperium could generate when threatened with total removal of its power source. The Battle of Baal was a preview of this interaction. When the Great Rift erupted during Leviathan's assault, the warp energy pouring through it struck the Tyranid fleet and disrupted it in ways that weapons had not achieved. Chaos and Tyranids are genuinely harmful to each other at a direct physical level. The theory asks whether this known antagonism, scaled up to the level of a galaxy's chaos entities mobilizing against a Tyranid invasion that has consumed most of their power source, might have been sufficient to push the hive mind into a retreat so total it crossed the intergalactic void to escape. This theory has the advantage of using only lore elements that already exist and extending their known dynamics to a larger scale. It does not require inventing new entities or new types of threat. It just requires asking, what would happen if the relationship between chaos and Tyranids that we can observe playing out in the Milky Way was applied to an entire galaxy? The answer, the theory suggests, is that the interaction at that scale might have been enough to produce exactly what we observe, a hive mind that has crossed the void and is now consuming a new galaxy with desperate urgency. The third theory is the one the official lore leans toward most consistently, and in some ways, it is the most disturbing of all. The Tyranids are not running from anything. They are simply hungry. They came to the Milky Way because they found it and it contained food. The same reason they came to every other galaxy they have visited. There is no deeper cause. There is no enemy behind them. There is just the hunger, ancient and bottomless and indifferent to any framework we might try to impose on it. This is the perspective that Dante arrived at when he looked into the Swarm Lord's eyes. He found the soul of the hive mind in that gaze, or the nearest thing to a soul that the hive mind possesses, and what he found was not power or menace or even predatory confidence. He found hunger so absolute that pity was the natural response. The hive mind is enslaved to its own appetite. It has no ability to step outside it, to look at itself clearly, to want something other than what it wants. It feeds because it must. It continues because there is no other option available to it. The galaxy we live in is the latest item in an infinitely long menu that began before human language existed and will end when there is nothing left to eat or when something stops the hive mind from consuming. The horror of this theory is different in texture from the others. The first and second theories are horrifying, but they offer structure. An enemy behind the Tyranids is something with shape. It can potentially be identified, engaged, played against the hive mind. A chaos conflict in another galaxy is understandable in the same conceptual terms as the chaos conflicts we already know about, just at larger scale. These are horrors you can build mental models around. Pure hunger without cause or context or limit is a force of nature, not a person, not an enemy. Not something that can be outwitted or reasoned with or bargained with or understood in any framework that produces a course of action. The universe simply contains this. As a matter of physical and biological reality, as a consequence of being old enough and large enough for everything that can happen to eventually happen somewhere, the Tyranids exist. They have been eating, they will keep eating. And the idea that the universe contains something of this scale and this nature pointed at everything, not out of malice or ambition or even self-defense, but simply because that is what it is the specific flavor of cosmic horror that the setting explores better than most science fiction ever has. The fourth theory involves the Old Ones and sits at the more speculative end of the range. The Old Ones are the most ancient race connected to the Milky Way's inhabited history. They seeded intelligent life across the galaxy billions of years ago, shaped the conditions that made most of the major factions possible, and fought the war in heaven against the Necrons roughly 60 to 70 million years ago, a conflict so devastating it permanently altered the galaxy's psychic landscape. And then they vanished. Where the Old Ones went and whether they survived is one of the great unanswered questions of the setting's ancient history. The theory holds that the Old Ones left the Milky Way intentionally, departing into the intergalactic void for reasons the current setting does not reveal. And the Tyranids are following them, not consciously, not through any decision the hive mind is aware of making, but through something deep in their genetic or psychic architecture, possibly placed there by the Old Ones themselves in some ancient interaction, a buried signal or directive too old and too fundamental to be recognized as external instruction rather than instinct. The hive mind turns towards certain signals without knowing why. Those signals may be the traces the Old Ones left in their passage through the void. This theory is almost entirely speculative. It has very thin canonical support, but it has a structural elegance within the setting because it ties the two great mysteries of the ancient history, the disappearance of the Old Ones, and the origin of the Tyranids, together in a way that makes the universe feel even larger and stranger than it already does. The fifth possibility is the most intellectually honest about what the lore actually tells us. The question may be permanently unanswerable within the fiction of the setting, and that unanswerability may be intentional and correct. The Tyranids came from outside the galaxy. They have been in the void for a very long time. Whatever they were doing and wherever they came from before the Pharaohs redirected them cannot be known by any entity currently in the Milky Way, because no witness exists who will speak. The Silent King has the closest thing to relevant knowledge, and he is not sharing it. The hive mind itself contains the answer, but the hive mind does not communicate with anything outside itself in ways that could produce usable testimony. The mystery is sealed, and sealed mysteries, in settings built on cosmic horror, are always more frightening than revelations. Because the specific horror that sealed mysteries generate is the horror of knowing that something is true while being unable to know what that truth is. The question sits there in the dark, confirmed as real by the evidence of the Tyranids' existence and behavior, but permanently beyond the reach of any individual or faction within the setting to actually answer. Whatever they are running from, if they are running at all, that phrase, that little qualifier at the end, it does not make the horror smaller. It makes it more durable, because it cannot be resolved into something smaller. It stays at full size, permanently. Before we move to the final section, it is worth pausing to assess what each theory would actually mean for the Milky Way's defenders if it were true. Because the theories are not just interesting as lore speculation, they have different practical implications for whether any of the setting's factions have a path forward that is anything other than endless grinding resistance. If the rival hive mind theory is correct, then somewhere in the universe there is an entity that defeated the Tyranids, or at least posed a sufficient threat to them that the hive mind chose flight over continued conflict. That entity is not aligned with the Milky Way's inhabitants. It does not know or care that the galaxy exists. But if the Tyranids are fleeing it, then the direction they are fleeing toward is the Milky Way, and eventually the pursuer, if there is one, would follow the trail of consumed galaxies and arrive at the same destination. This means the defenders of the Milky Way might face the Tyranids and whatever is behind them in succession. One crisis resolved into a worse one. That is a pattern the 40K setting is very comfortable with. If the chaos theory is correct, there is an irony that the setting would likely appreciate. The chaos gods of the Milky Way are already present and already engaged with the galaxy's inhabitants. The forces of the ruinous powers are enemies of the Imperium, enemies of the Eldar, enemies of everything that lives. But they are enemies that the galaxy has been fighting, somewhat successfully, for 10,000 years. The war in heaven produced a warp that is saturated with the power of emotion and conflict, and the entities that live in that warp are among the most dangerous things in the setting. If a version of those entities in another galaxy was sufficient to drive the Tyranids out, then the warp itself, the thing the Imperium fears above almost everything else, may be one of the strongest defenses the Milky Way has against the Great Devourer. Not a defense anyone planned for, not a defense anyone wants to rely on, but a structural property of the galaxy's Imperium that may prove decisive in ways that no one has fully thought through. If pure hunger is the answer, then the implications are the simplest and the most brutal. The galaxy has no allies waiting in the void, no wild card, no third party whose presence changes the strategic picture. Just the hive mind, driven by appetite alone, consuming on a geological timescale, and the defenders of the Milky Way buying time as efficiently as they can, manage with whatever tools they can assemble. This is the bleakest version of the future. It is also the version most consistent with what the lore explicitly says. The setting does not often deliver hidden comfort. If the Old One's theory is correct, and the Tyranids are following a signal or directive encoded so deep in their biology that the hive mind itself cannot distinguish it from instinct, then the Milky Way may be a destination in a way that goes beyond the Pharos incident and the Astronomicon. If the Old Ones, who seeded this galaxy with life, are also the ultimate origin point of whatever brought the Tyranids into existence, then the conflict playing out in the settings present is the final act of a story that began long before any current faction drew its first breath. And the ending of that story is not something any current character has the context to even recognize, let alone influence. All of these possibilities are real, in the sense that the setting has not ruled any of them out. They exist simultaneously as the range of what might be true, and the truth behind them, whatever it is, shapes everything that is happening and everything that will happen in the galaxy, for as long as there are inhabitants capable of being affected by it. Part 9. The terrifying answer. So what is the actual answer? What are the Tyranids running from? The honest answer, the one the lore supports without requiring speculation, is that we do not know. Games Workshop has deliberately and consistently maintained this ambiguity. The canonical sources acknowledge the mystery without resolving it, frame it as a question without supplying the response, gesture toward the horror without completing the gesture. Whether that is a narrative strategy they intend to eventually resolve, or a permanent feature of the setting, is something only the people making the decisions at Games Workshop know. In either case, what the lore has given us is the question in its fullest form, and that full form is enough to work with. What the lore does tell us, and what we can build from what is known, is a picture that is frightening on its own terms, regardless of which specific theory turns out to reflect whatever truth exists behind the fiction. We know the Tyranids came from outside the galaxy, and were already in transit through the void when the Pharaohs reached them. We know that the various hive fleets approach from multiple different directions, implying their presence in the intergalactic void surrounding the Milky Way is distributed across an enormous volume of space rather than concentrated at a single point. We know that at least one official source claims they may have consumed 1,000 galaxies, which, if accurate at any meaningful order of magnitude, makes the Milky Way a very late entry in a very long history. We know that the Silent King of the Necrons encountered the Tyranids in the void during his 60-million-year exile, and found what he observed significant enough to end that exile and dedicate himself to opposing them, while simultaneously refusing to share the substance of what he learned. We know that when Dante of the Blood Angels looked into the Swarm Lord's eyes and perceived the soul of the hive mind directly, he felt pity. The hunger he encountered there made the worst thing his own chapter struggles with seem trivial. The hive mind is not triumphant. It is not predatory in the way that suggests comfort or dominance. It is driven, enslaved to its own nature, consuming because it cannot do otherwise, existing entirely in the service of an appetite that nothing has ever satisfied and nothing ever will. Consider the question of what it means that those hive fleets approaching from different directions are all the same consciousness. The hive mind is not like a nation that has multiple armies deployed in different regions while the civilian population goes about its business at home. The hive mind's home is its fleets. Every organism in every fleet is a cell in the same body. There is no civilian population. There is no rear area. There is only the swarm, distributed across space, with different portions of it currently in contact with the Milky Way, while other portions approach from other directions, and still more remain in the void in various states of dormancy and transit. The scale of the biological presence the hive mind represents, when you try to hold the full picture in mind at once, defeats comprehension in a way that even the other enormous threats in the setting do not quite produce. Chaos is vast and ancient, but it operates through the warp, through a parallel dimension, and while its influence on the material universe is devastating, it is mediated through that dimensional barrier. The Necrons are numerous and ancient and sleep in their tomb worlds, but they are discrete. They are here. You can find them. The Tyranids are in the material universe, physically present, distributed across the spaces between galaxies, surrounding the Milky Way in a sphere of slow-moving biological mass that is approaching from all sides and that the setting's inhabitants have detected only the very leading edge of. The hive fleets that have struck the Milky Way, Behemoth and Kraken and Leviathan and Gorgon and Kronos and all the rest, are the first arrivals. The early vanguard. What follows is described in the lore as the main body, still in the void, still crossing the distance, and the main body is to the hive fleets, already encountered as an ocean is to its surface waves. That comparison is in the official sources. It is not community exaggeration. The Imperium's best strategic minds believe that what has been seen so far is a small fraction of what is coming. This is the point at which the question of whether the Tyranids are running from something takes on a specific practical dimension that goes beyond philosophical interest in the setting's mysteries. If the Tyranids are fleeing something, then behind the vast biological mass that is approaching the Milky Way from every direction, behind the ocean of hive fleet and spare fleet and dormant fleet that the lore describes as still on its way, there is something else. Something that the hive mind, with all of its accumulated adaptations and all of the biological heritage of 1,000 consumed galaxies in its genetic library, found it preferable to run from rather than fight. Something that drove an entity of that scale and that capability out of its territory and across millions of light-years of void. That something has not yet appeared in the Milky Way's history. But if the Tyranids are in flight, the thing they are fleeing is behind them. It has a direction of travel. It is following the wake of consumed galaxies and stripped worlds that marks the Tyranids' passage through the universe. And when it arrives at whatever galaxy the Tyranids are currently in, whether that is the Milky Way or whatever follows, the relationship will repeat. If the Tyranids are not fleeing anything, the implications are different, but no less large. The universe simply contains this: biological predation at galactic scale. An organism with no origin story that would make it comprehensible, no enemy that gave it purpose, no event that shaped it into something targeted, just what it is, ancient and hungry and vast, moving from galaxy to galaxy, because that is what it does, because that is what it has always done, because the universe is old enough and large enough to contain something like this as a natural feature of its biology. Either possibility is genuine cosmic horror. Either the darkness outside the galaxy contains a pursuer, something that even the Great Devourer ran from, or the darkness outside the galaxy is simply dark, and the universe in its age and scale has produced the Great Devourer as one of the things it contains, and the Milky Way and all that lives in it is just the next meal, not a setting for a story, but a food source. There is something that needs to be said about what the defenders of the galaxy can actually do with this information, because the picture this video has built could produce despair, and despair is neither useful nor accurate as a response. Every victory matters. Every world held is biomass the hive mind does not gain. Every splinter fleet destroyed is information the hive mind must regenerate somewhere else. Every generation of defenders that forces the Tyranids to adapt buys time for something else to happen. And in a universe as strange and unpredictable as the one these stories are set in, time is the most valuable resource that exists. The setting has the Silent King working towards something he is not revealing. It has the Eldar seers watching futures that no human eye can see. It has the possibility that the conflict the Tyranids are fleeing, if they are fleeing one, might produce an unexpected variable, a third party whose presence in the Milky Way's history was not accounted for. The Tyranid threat is not solved by any of this. It is not made smaller, but it is not, as far as the lore allows us to see, definitively hopeless either. The setting does not offer clean, hopeful narratives. It offers a darkness so complete that any light within it matters, and the people who fight within that darkness are not naive optimists, but beings who understand the scale of what they face and fight anyway, because the alternative is to stop and wait, and be consumed while they wait. The question of what the Tyranids are running from, or whether they are running at all, is ultimately a question about the nature of the universe the setting describes. Is the darkness outside the galaxy filled with something that even the Great Devourer fears? Or is the darkness simply dark, and the Great Devourer simply what it is, with nothing behind it but more hunger and more void? Both answers describe a universe so large and so strange and so indifferent to the affairs of the species that live within any given galaxy that the appropriate response, the one the setting has always implicitly recommended, is not to find comfort in the scale or to be paralyzed by it. The appropriate response is to fight, not because the outcome is certain, not because the darkness can be driven back permanently, but because fighting is what the things that are worth being alive do in the face of things that would consume them. Because the alternative to fighting is being consumed, and the choice between those two options is the only one the universe is genuinely offering. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and in the void beyond the far future, there is only hunger and silence, and the slow passage of something vast and ancient and indifferent between the stars. Whether something follows in its wake, or whether the wake is all there is, that question remains open. The stars burn, and the worlds turn, and the hive fleets push deeper into the Milky Way, and somewhere in the cold, between galaxies, the silent bulk of what is still to come draws closer, patient, the way only something that does not experience time can be patient. The question sits in the dark without an answer, and that is exactly where it belongs. There is one final thought worth sitting with as we come to the end of this, and it concerns the specific kind of courage that the setting demands of everyone who fights in it. The defenders of the Milky Way, the Ultramarines standing at Macragge, the Blood Angels at Baal, the Eldar of Iyanden throwing everything they had at Kraken, the Guardsmen and the Sisters, and the Mechanicus Adepts, and the ordinary people who took up weapons they barely knew how to use when the spore pods started falling. None of them were fighting with the knowledge that they would win. None of them were fighting because they believed the threat was manageable in the long run. Most of them were fighting with the understanding, in whatever form they were able to hold it, that they were buying time. That what they were doing was not solving the problem, but preventing the problem from ending everything immediately. That the gift they were giving, if they succeeded, was not victory, but continuation. That is a specific and unusual kind of courage. It is not the courage of people who believe in the justice of their cause and trust that justice will be vindicated. It is not the courage of people who think their side is going to win. It is the courage of people who understand exactly how bad the situation is and choose to fight anyway, not because fighting will fix it, but because not fighting would mean those people they are protecting, the people in the Underhive who do not know what is coming, the children on worlds that have not yet been targeted, the future generations that will exist if this battle is won and will not exist if it is lost, do not deserve to be abandoned simply because the long-term picture is dark. The grimdark setting is sometimes discussed as if its defining characteristic is despair, as if the entire point is to demonstrate how terrible everything is and how hopeless the future looks. That reading misses something important. The darkness in the setting is not the message. The message is what people do inside the darkness. The Ultramarines' first company dying to the last man in the polar fortresses is not a story about how futile resistance is. It is a story about 200 people choosing to spend themselves completely in service of something they believed mattered. The Blood Angels at Baal are not a story about inevitable defeat. They are a story about a chapter that looked at the end, coming toward it, and refused to make it easy. That refusal is the thing the setting is actually about. The darkness is the context. The refusal is the content. And the question of what the Tyranids are running from, or not running from, lives inside that context. If something is behind them, then the defenders are fighting not just the immediate threat, but the first wave of something larger. If nothing is behind them, then the defenders are fighting the largest single thing anyone in this setting has ever faced, and they are doing it knowing exactly what it is, and they are doing it anyway. In either case, the stars burn. The hive fleets advance. The question remains open in the dark. And somewhere in the Milky Way, right now in the fiction, someone is fighting. Not because they expect to win, because they have decided that what they are protecting is worth spending themselves on completely, as long as there is any chance at all that spending themselves completely might give the next person a little more time. That is what the setting is, underneath everything else. A meditation on what it means to fight when the odds are as bad as odds can get. The answer to the question of what the Tyranids are running from does not change that. It just gives that fight a slightly different background to be set against. That is the whole picture. The Pharos that lit up the void like a beacon and called something that had been dormant for 10,000 years. The hive mind that is simultaneously one consciousness and an ocean of biological presence surrounding the galaxy. The three great wars, and the fourth that is still being fought, each one harder than the last. The Genestealer cults incubating on worlds that don't know yet that they are already dying. The stripped and silent galaxies that may be waiting in the dark beyond the Milky Way's rim. The silent king who saw what is coming from the outside and came home and sealed away what he learned. And the question at the center of all of it that has no clean answer and may never have one. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. This is one of the questions in the setting that I find most worth spending time on, because sitting with it changes how everything else in the lore looks. The wars in the Milky Way, the factions and their conflicts, and their moments of heroism and tragedy, they all look different when you understand that they are taking place in the shadow of something this old and this large. Drop a comment. Tell me which theory you find most compelling, and why. Tell me if you think the mystery serves the setting better than any resolution could. Tell me what other corners of this universe you want to go deep on, because there is a great deal more of this to come. Subscribe if you haven't. There is so much more where this came from.